November 13th, 1916. The Somme Valley, France. Dawn breaks over a landscape transformed into hell itself. British artillery batteries have been pounding German positions for hours, preparing the way for another infantry assault. Thousands of shells scream overhead, arcing toward enemy trenches. But something is terribly, catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant James Hartley crouches in a muddy trench, watching the barrage through a periscope. He's seen dozens of these preparatory bombardments. He knows what devastation they should bring. But today, the explosions sound different, muffled, weak, and far too many shells are simply burying themselves into the mud without detonating at all. Hartley feels his stomach tighten. In less than an hour, he'll lead his men over the top. Their lives depend on those shells destroying the German wire, collapsing their dugouts, silencing their machine guns. Behind him, Private Thomas Webb clutches his rifle with white knuckles. He's 19 years old. This is his first assault. He's been told the artillery will clear the way, that they'll walk across open ground facing minimal resistance. Webb watches his lieutenant's face and sees something that terrifies him more than the thought of German bullets. He sees doubt. At 0 hour, whistles blow. Men climb ladders. They advance across no man's land. And within seconds, German machine guns open fire from positions that should have been obliterated. The guns that should have been silenced. The wire that should have been cut. All intact. All deadly. By nightfall, another 2,000 British soldiers are casualties. And in London, 400 miles away, officials at the War Office are beginning to realize they're facing a crisis that could lose them the war. Not a crisis of courage. Not a crisis of strategy. But a crisis of faulty ammunition that's killing their own men through failure rather than enemy action. This is the story of Britain's most dangerous secret of 1916. The ammunition crisis that nearly broke the British Army, and the desperate race to fix it before it was too late. The scale of the problem became undeniable in the weeks following the November offensives. Reports flooded into the War Office from every sector of the Somme front. Artillery officers documented failure rates that should have been impossible. Some batteries reported that 30% of their shells were duds. 30%. In some cases, the rate climbed even higher. Major General Henry Rawlinson, commanding the Fourth Army, sent an urgent telegram that landed on desks in London like a bombshell of its own. The message was blunt. Artillery support had become unreliable. Infantry commanders could no longer trust the preparatory bombardments. Men were dying because shells that should have exploded were burying themselves harmlessly in French mud. The implications were staggering. Britain had spent 2 years building up the largest munitions production system in its history. Factories across the country were working around the clock. Women had flooded into munitions work, filling shells, assembling fuses, packing explosives. The nation had transformed itself into an arsenal, and now, somehow, that arsenal was producing weapons that didn't work. On November 20th, 1916, an emergency meeting convened at the Ordnance Board headquarters in London. The men who gathered in that oak-paneled room represented the highest levels of Britain's military-industrial complex. There were generals who understood battlefield requirements. There were civil servants who managed the vast network of munitions factories. And there were scientists and engineers who designed the weapons themselves. The chairman, Major General Sir Stanley von Donop, Master General of the Ordnance, opened the meeting with words that sent a chill through everyone present. Gentlemen, we are facing a catastrophe. Our shells are failing at rates that make artillery support nearly worthless. If we cannot solve this problem and solve it quickly, we will lose the ability to conduct offensive operations. We will lose the initiative. And we may very well lose this war. The room fell silent. These were men accustomed to solving problems, but the scale of this one was unprecedented. Millions of shells had already been produced. Millions more were in the production pipeline. If the fuses were fundamentally flawed, the implications for Britain's war effort were almost unthinkable. The task of diagnosing the problem fell to a hastily assembled team that would work out of Woolwich Arsenal, the ancient military complex in southeast London that had been producing weapons for the British Army since the 17th century. The team leader was Dr. Robert Monde, a civilian metallurgist who had been consulting for the War Office on various technical matters. Monde was 52 years old, a brilliant scientist with a reputation for methodical problem-solving. He had made his fortune in the chemical industry before the war. Now, he found himself responsible for potentially saving thousands of British lives. Monde assembled a team that mixed military expertise with civilian technical knowledge. There were artillery officers who understood how shells were supposed to function in combat. There were engineers from the major munitions factories who knew the production processes intimately. And there were scientists who could analyze the metallurgy, the chemistry, the physics of why things were going wrong. They set up their operation in a building at Woolwich that had previously been used for routine testing. Now it became the center of the most urgent investigation in British military history. The first challenge was getting their hands on actual failed shells from the front. This proved more difficult than expected. Unexploded ordnance was dangerous to transport. Many duds were buried deep in mud, and there was the constant risk that a shell that had failed to detonate on impact might still explode if disturbed. But by early December, crates began arriving at Woolwich, shells recovered from the Somme battlefield, each one a potential bomb, each one a piece of evidence. Dr. Monde's team worked with extreme caution, setting up examination areas with blast walls and safety protocols. They began the painstaking process of disassembling failed shells to understand what had gone wrong. What they found was both illuminating and terrifying. The shells themselves were generally sound. The explosive charges were properly mixed and packed. The problem lay in the fuses, specifically in the percussion mechanisms that were supposed to trigger detonation upon impact. Captain William Thornton, a Royal Artillery officer assigned to the investigation team, made the first crucial observation. He had been examining fuses under magnification when he noticed something odd. There was corrosion. Not extensive, but present. Green and white deposits on the brass components of the percussion mechanism. Thornton called Dr. Monde over. The two men studied the corroded parts in silence. Then Monde asked the question that would crack the case wide open. "Captain, how long would these shells have been in storage or transit before being fired?" Thornton considered. "Could be weeks. Could be months. They're shipped from factories to depots. Then to France. Then to forward ammunition dumps. Then to battery positions. In this weather they're sitting in mud and rain the whole time." Monde nodded slowly. "And the fuse mechanisms? Are they sealed against moisture?" Thornton's face went pale. He knew the answer. They weren't. Not adequately. The fuses were designed to be robust, but they weren't designed to be waterproof. In the dry conditions of peacetime testing, that had never been a problem. But the Western Front in winter was anything but dry. Rain fell constantly. Trenches were rivers of mud. Ammunition was stored in conditions that would have been unthinkable in peacetime, and moisture was getting into the fuses. The team began testing this hypothesis systematically. They took functioning fuses and subjected them to moisture exposure that simulated battlefield conditions, soaking, humidity, temperature fluctuations. Then they tested the fuses. The results were damning. Moisture penetration compromised the percussion mechanisms in multiple ways. Water caused corrosion that interfered with the mechanical action of the firing pin. It created a film that dampened the impact. In some cases, it caused the spring mechanisms to seize up entirely. After just a few weeks of exposure to conditions typical of the Western Front, perfectly good fuses became unreliable. The failure rate climbed from near zero to 30% or higher. Britain had been shipping millions of shells to France with fuses that were being destroyed by the weather before they could be fired. The discovery of the root cause was only the beginning. Now came the harder part, fixing it. Dr. Mohn's team faced a challenge that seemed almost impossible. They needed to redesign the fuses to be waterproof. They needed to do it quickly, because men were dying every day. They needed to do it in a way that could be implemented across dozens of factories. And they needed to do it without compromising the reliability of the percussion mechanism itself. Making something waterproof wasn't simple. The fuse had to remain mechanically sound. It had to function reliably under the tremendous shock of being fired from a gun. It had to survive the flight through the air. And then it had to detonate instantly upon impact, even after weeks or months of exposure to the worst weather conditions imaginable. Mohn divided his team into groups, each tackling a different aspect of the problem. One group focused on redesigning the seals around the percussion mechanism. They experimented with different materials: rubber gaskets, waxed paper, metal-to-metal seals machined to incredibly tight tolerances. Another group worked on protective coatings for the internal components. If moisture did penetrate the outer seals, could they prevent it from causing corrosion? They tested various oils, greases, and chemical treatments. A third group focused on the quality control problem. Even the best redesign would be worthless if it wasn't implemented properly across the entire production system. They needed testing protocols that could verify each batch of fuses before they left the factory. The work was exhausting. The team worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week. They worked through Christmas 1916 while British soldiers huddled in frozen trenches in France. They worked through New Year's while the casualty lists grew longer, and slowly, painfully, they made progress. By mid-January 1917, they had a prototype solution. The redesigned fuse incorporated multiple improvements. There was a new sealing system that used precisely machined brass components with rubber gaskets. The percussion mechanism itself was treated with a special corrosion-resistant coating, and there were new quality control tests that would be performed on every batch. But prototypes weren't enough. They needed to prove the redesign worked under actual battlefield conditions. Dr. Mohn arranged for a field test that would be conducted at a proving ground that simulated Western Front conditions as closely as possible. They created muddy storage areas. They subjected the new fuses to weeks of rain and cold. Then they loaded them into shells and fired them. The results were remarkable. The failure rate dropped from 30% to less than 5%. Even after a month of exposure to simulated battlefield conditions, the new fuses remained reliable. It was the breakthrough they needed. But now came perhaps the most daunting challenge of all: implementing the changes across Britain's vast munitions production system. There were dozens of factories producing fuses. Each one would need to retool. Each one would need new quality control procedures. Each one would need to be brought up to the new standard. And it all had to happen while maintaining production levels, because the war wasn't waiting. Major General von Donop assigned a team of inspectors to fan out across the country. Their job was to work with each factory, implementing the new designs and procedures. It was a massive logistical undertaking. Some factories adapted quickly. Others struggled with the tighter tolerances required by the new seals. There were delays. There were mistakes. There were moments when it seemed the whole effort might collapse under its own complexity. But slowly, factory by factory, the new fuses began rolling off production lines. By February 1917, the first shipments of the improved ammunition were reaching France. Artillery officers were skeptical at first. They had lost faith in their shells, but orders came down from high command. The ammunition problem had been identified and fixed. The new shells were to be trusted. Lieutenant James Hartley, the officer who had watched in horror as shells failed during the November offensive, received his battery's first shipment of the new ammunition in early March. He examined the shells carefully. The fuses looked different. There were new markings indicating they had passed enhanced quality control tests. On March 15, 1917, Hartley's battery was assigned to support an attack on German positions near Arras. It was a smaller operation than the Great Somme offensives, but it would serve as a test. The new ammunition's first real trial under fire. Hartley supervised the loading personally. Each shell was checked. Each fuse was verified. At 5:30 hours the barrage began. The sound was different, sharper, more consistent. Hartley watched through his periscope as shells impacted German trenches. The explosions were what they should be: devastating, reliable. Every shell that left his guns detonated as designed. After 90 minutes of bombardment, the infantry went over the top. This time, they advanced across ground that had been properly prepared. German wire was cut. German positions were destroyed. German defenders were suppressed. The attack succeeded with minimal casualties. That evening, Hartley wrote in his diary, "Today, for the first time in months, our guns did what they were supposed to do. Every shell exploded. Our boys had the support they needed. We took our objectives. This is what it should always have been." Similar reports began flowing in from across the front. The new ammunition worked. Failure rates had dropped from 30% to less than 5%. In many cases, they were even lower. Artillery officers regained confidence in their weapons. Infantry commanders could once again trust that preparatory bombardments would do their job. The crisis was over, but the impact of those months of failure had been profound. Historians would later estimate that the faulty ammunition crisis of late 1916 had contributed to thousands of unnecessary British casualties. Men who had died not because of enemy action, but because their own artillery support had failed them. The psychological toll had been equally severe. Soldiers had lost faith in their own weapons. Officers had been forced to send men into attacks knowing the artillery preparation was inadequate. The trauma of those months would linger long after the technical problem was solved. Dr. Robert Monde and his team at Woolwich Arsenal received little public recognition for their work. The ammunition crisis was kept quiet. The British government didn't want to advertise that their munitions production had nearly collapsed, that their shells had been failing at catastrophic rates, that thousands of soldiers had been endangered by faulty equipment. But within military circles, the importance of what they had accomplished was well understood. They had identified a critical failure in Britain's war-making capability. They had diagnosed the root cause under tremendous pressure, and they had implemented a solution across an entire industrial system in a matter of months. By spring 1917, as British forces prepared for new offensives, the artillery arm was restored to full effectiveness. The shells that screamed overhead were reliable once again. The fuses that should have detonated did detonate, and the infantry that advanced behind those barrages did so with the support they needed and deserved. The lessons learned at Woolwich Arsenal in the winter of 1916 and 1917 would reshape British munitions production for the rest of the war. Quality control procedures were tightened across the board. Testing protocols became more rigorous, and the importance of designing weapons that could function in actual battlefield conditions, not just in peacetime proving grounds, became a fundamental principle. Captain William Thornton, the artillery officer who had first noticed the corrosion on the fuse mechanisms, would later write about the experience in his memoirs. We had been so focused on producing shells in vast quantities that we had forgotten the most basic principle. A weapon that doesn't work is worse than no weapon at all. It gives false confidence. It gets men killed. What we learned that winter was that quality matters more than quantity, that one reliable shell is worth 10 duds, that the men in the trenches deserve equipment they can trust with their lives. The story of the ammunition crisis reveals something fundamental about the nature of modern warfare. Victory doesn't just depend on courage or tactics or strategy. It depends on the unglamorous work of logistics, quality control, and industrial production. It depends on civilian scientists and military engineers working together to solve problems that no one anticipated. It depends on the ability to identify failures, diagnose causes, and implement solutions under pressure. The men who fixed Britain's ammunition crisis weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't charge enemy positions. They didn't fly combat missions. They didn't command fleets, but in their own way they were just as crucial to the war effort. They worked in laboratories and factories. They tested and measured and calculated. They redesigned and retooled and inspected, and by doing so, they saved countless lives. By the time the war ended in November 1918, British artillery had fired over 170 million shells. The vast majority of them worked exactly as designed. They exploded on impact. They destroyed enemy positions. They supported infantry advances. They helped win the war. But that reliability, that effectiveness, was built on the foundation laid during those desperate months in the winter of 1916 and 1917. When a team at Woolwich Arsenal raced against time to fix a problem that threatened to undermine Britain's entire war effort, the soldiers who benefited from their work never knew their names, never knew the crisis had existed, never knew how close they had come to fighting a war with weapons that couldn't be trusted. They simply knew that when they went over the top, when they advanced across no man's land, when they relied on their artillery to clear the way, the shells exploded as they should. And sometimes in war, that's the greatest victory of all. The quiet triumph of making sure the weapons work, of ensuring that when lives are on the line, the equipment doesn't fail, of restoring confidence in the tools that soldiers must trust with their lives. The ammunition crisis of 1916 was one of Britain's closest kept secrets of the First World War. But it was also one of the most important problems ever solved under pressure. A reminder that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in arsenals and laboratories. Not just by soldiers, but by scientists and engineers. Not just through courage, but through competence. And that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought against failure itself.